What would you think of a man who insisted on preaching that Brazil is paradise? Or that Portuguese was spoken in the Garden of Eden, and that paradise was actually hidden somewhere in the mountains of Minas Gerais? Or even that the forbidden fruit by which Adam and Eve were tempted was actually a banana? That's what Pedro Duarte's Henequim preached, one of the most forgotten millenarians in Brazil, who would end his days being persecuted by the Portuguese Inquisition and by the King of Portugal himself as an enemy of the state. But after all, why did he preach such strange things? What was the origin of all this? How did his trial in the Inquisition take place? And how did a simple man who exalted Portugal to an almost divine level become one of the greatest enemies of the Portuguese crown? In today's video, we're going to talk about Pedro Duarte's Henequim and the forgotten messianism of one of the most controversial figures in history. But before we start the video, if you like our content, become a member of our channel right now. Pedro Duarte's Henequim was born in 1680 in Lisbon, Portugal, as the illegitimate son of a Dutch Calvinist and a Portuguese Catholic. Having been educated at the Dutch embassy in Lisbon and having studied at a Jesuit college, when he came of age, he decided to go to Brazil in order to escape any Calvinist influence from the Dutch embassy. As news spread about the wealth and gold in Minas Gerais, Pedro Duarte decided to go there to seek fortune, joining many other Portuguese and Boaba in Brazil's interior. There, Pedro came into contact with the ideas of Antonio Vieira and lived in a hostile environment where law and order were practically non-existent. But he was infected by the hope of getting rich at any moment. And there, seeing Brazil's prosperity, he deepened his vision about the Fifth Empire. The Fifth Empire was a millenarian ideal that preached that the Portuguese Empire would be the greatest exponent of Christ's new coming, and that the kings of Portugal would spread not only Christ, but would also be the great temporal power in the spiritual reign of Jesus. In Brazil, Pedro Duarte's witnessed the War of the Emboabas and heard about the War of the Mascates. And this increased in him the ideas about how to solve local politics. He stayed in contact with many people, including new Christians and a Judaizing priest named Manuel Lopes de Carvalho. And the great mix of nationalities, languages, religions, and cultures was the main driving force behind the mysticism he would develop. After 20 years in Brazil, Pedro returned to Lisbon in 1722. In the capital, he was forced to marry Joana Maria da Encarnação, with whom he would have a daughter, Maria Rita. But apparently that marriage failed. The marriage he was forced into gave him neither happiness nor stability. Besides not developing a married life with his wife, he was also growing more and more distant from his own family, preferring to discuss his ideas in the streets of Lisbon. There he began to discuss theology and politics in a very fervent and fearless way. Henequim wandered among different sources of knowledge and claimed to have more clarity and interpretation than the Catholic Church's own priests. And that's when he revealed one of his boldest ideas. The King of Portugal, Dom João V, had a brother named Dom Manuel Bartolomeu. This brother had asked the king for help to be elected as the King of Poland, which at the time was an elective monarchy, or for some state in Germany to be bought so that he could also rule. That's where Henequim comes in. He started preaching around Lisbon that Dom Manuel would help consolidate the Fifth Empire through Brazil, actually becoming the new emperor of Brazil as the autonomous empire of Portugal. So he should be named not as the King of Poland, but as the King of Brazil. But Pedro had no idea how big of a problem he was getting himself into. Dom João V's father, Dom Pedro II, had taken the throne from his brother Afonso IV, who was declared insane. So a man in Lisbon was publicly encouraging the king's brother to overthrow him and make Brazil independent. And since he was also a spendthrift and eccentric brother, with similar actions already present in the family's history. Along with this dangerous idea, he made many absurd statements that soon got him reported to the Inquisition. Pedro thus appears before the Holy Office to answer. And, interestingly, he goes without any fear, claiming that everything he preaches is not against the Catholic faith, but rather goes beyond it. The inquisitors have access to both his texts and the most absurd theses he spread in Lisbon. He claimed the Garden of Eden was in central Brazil, in the Minas Gerais Mountains, where the fruit with which Adam and Eve were tempted by the serpent could also be found, and that it would be our very well-known banana. And Henequim, before the Portuguese Inquisition, mixed his own interpretations of the scriptures with completely unfounded statements. Unfortunately, his writings were destroyed by the court, but through the records in the Inquisition process, we can access what he said. Tiago Maier, in his article on Pedro de Rates, clearly reveals the ideas in his Inquisition records. Portuguese was the first language spoken, taught by God to Adam in paradise, after creating the 28 letters of the alphabet. With it, all perfection is written, and through it, all knowledge was shared. And this language was spoken until the confusion of Babylon. That the Portuguese language is the most perfect of all, and it is the one that God spoke with the divine people and with his courtiers in heaven, and the one in which the angels sing hymns and praises in heaven. It is also the language used to write the Book of Life and all heavenly books. It is the language that is taught and that will be spoken in the fifth empire of the Portuguese, which is near, and which will be in Brazil, the place of the earthly paradise. And that Adam left written in Portuguese for his descendants on palm leaves, and that they exist in Brazil. In other words, not only was Eden in Brazil, but Portuguese was also heaven's language. Pedro also believed that the Amazon River and the São Francisco River were the rivers mentioned in the scriptures. But beyond these innocent doctrines, he also mused about things related to faith. Henequim discussed the sexuality of angels, belief in the power of letters, and the Virgin Mary's androgyny. Pedro also uttered heresies about the angelic nature, describing it as composed of feminine and masculine parts generated from the earth, and that all divine creatures possessed a physical body and a spiritual body. After that, he began to weave long and astonishing theories about the genitals of Maria, mother of Jesus Christ. According to him, she could not be a normal woman, and described her as having an androgynous nature, stating that she could not have feminine characteristics and thus be the mother of the incarnate Word. The very priests of the Portuguese Inquisition were horrified by Henequim's statements. The Inquisitor Caetano Gouveia categorically stated that in all ecclesiastical history, such monstrosities have never been found, and that only a madman could conceive them, and that all of it seemed more like delirium than heresy, and that the inquisitors themselves believed that no one could take it seriously. But then a major problem arose. If Henequim were simply insane, he could never be condemned by the Inquisition. The Inquisition was only for people who refused to deny a heresy, and sanity was essential for someone to be condemned. And the worst part is that the priests themselves, who had to classify erratic behaviors within some existing heresy, no matter how competent and intelligent they were, had not been able to find anything like what that man was saying. He had simply invented a completely new heretical cosmology. And it got even worse when he spoke even more absurdities about the origin of the universe from 7 gods of fire, these gods being male and female, and that within him were the Holy Trinity, Christ, Mary, the angelic Word, and the angelic Paracleted. To make matters worse, when confronted with Catholic doctrine, Pedro did not deny it. He simply said he was beyond it. When witnesses were called, they all unanimously declared Henequim's full lucidity and literacy, and that there was absolutely nothing normal about his behavior. After all, he had an enormous knowledge of the scriptures, but he simply chose to interpret them according to his own convenience and according to the filter that he himself admitted existed in his mind. A process that started as an investigation into a betrayal against Dom João V soon became a religious issue. The judge who carried out the arrest even described with great precision Pedro's intelligence, education, and vast knowledge of the scriptures. The process would last about 3 years, and throughout this process, the inquisitors changed their narrative from seeing him as a completely insane man to a man who was physically capable but refused to renounce his ideas, thus being a penitent. And in this way, he was executed and burned at an auto da fe around midnight on June 21st, 1744, at the Rocio, with his crosses being thrown into the Tagus River. His execution was personally witnessed by the King of Portugal, Dom João V, who considered Henequim a state criminal, suspecting not only the independence of Brazil but also that a betrayal might be committed by his own brother. In his article about Pedro de Rates, Plinio Freire Gomes suggests that his crime was much more political than religious. The intention of having him condemned as a heretic and not for the crime of lèse-majesté was precisely to discredit his political ideas, since no one really took his religious ones seriously. And that's how Pedro de Rates turned his millenarian delusions into a danger for the King of Portugal. That's because no matter how absurd his ideas might have been, if he found supporters over time, it could lead to consequences that no one could foresee. Did you know Pedro de Rates? What surprised you most? So go ahead and leave your comment right now to support our work, and while you're at it, become a member of the channel right now. That way, you'll be able to dive deeper and learn even more about the fascinating Iberian history